The letter from Tobias Greer described a working cattle operation outside Laramie, Wyoming territory. It mentioned a 4-room house, a reliable well, and neighbors within reasonable distance. It did not mention that the cattle operation consisted of 11 head, 2 of which were sick, that the 4-room house had a 4th room, only if you counted the lean-to where he stored seed corn, that the reliable well required a specific sequence of pumps and a firm kick to the iron handle before it gave water, and that the neighbors within reasonable distance were the Eckhart brothers, who were reasonable in no way anyone had yet discovered. The letter from Nettie Prouse described a capable woman of practical background and sound constitution. It mentioned experience managing a household, and a willingness to work hard in a new environment. It did not mention that Nettie had spent the last 11 years managing the household of her widowed father, who had died in March and left her with nothing but a house that belonged to the bank, a trunk of good clothes that belonged to a life she no longer had, and a name she had spent her whole life trying to make mean something in a town that had already decided what it meant. They were both telling the truth in the way people tell the truth when they leave out everything that matters. I have read a great many letters written by lonely people to strangers. There is a grammar to them. Everyone describes what they have, almost no one describes what they need. Tobias Greer needed someone who would not leave when she saw the lean-to. Nettie Prouse needed somewhere she was not already defined. Neither of them wrote that down. Tobias Greer was 41 years old, built like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and had simply gotten used to the weight. He had come to Wyoming from Ohio at 26 with his younger brother Clyde, and the two of them had spent 3 years building the operation. If 11 head and a kickstart well counted as an operation, before Clyde married a woman from Cheyenne and moved south to be closer to her family. Tobias did not begrudge him this. He understood it. He simply did not know what to do with a house that had been built for 2 people and now held 1, or with evenings that had once been filled with argument and laughter, and were now filled with the sound of wind off the Laramie Range and his own thoughts, which were not particularly good company. He had written to the matrimonial agency in April. He had not wanted to. He wanted to want to, and he had eventually decided that was close enough. Nettie arrived on a Tuesday in September, which was not a kind month in Wyoming. The sky was the color of an old bruise and the wind came sideways off the flats and did not care what it hit. Tobias was at the depot in town because he was a man who showed up where he said he would. He had pressed his shirt. He had combed his hair. He was holding his hat in both hands because the wind would have taken it otherwise, and he was standing at the end of the platform looking at the passengers coming off the train, with an expression I can only describe as a man bracing for impact. Nettie Prouse stepped off the train and stood very still for a moment, looking at the town. The town of Laramie, Wyoming, in September of 1887, was not an impressive sight. It had a main street, a general store, a saloon, a church that argued with the saloon about noise on Saturday nights, and a depot that smelled of coal smoke and ambition. It had survived a great deal and showed every bit of it. Nettie looked at it for about 4 seconds. Then she picked up her traveling case and walked toward the man holding his hat in both hands with the expression of someone who had already accepted the worst and was waiting to be wrong. She held out her hand. She said, "You must be Mr. Greer," he said. "I am." "You must be Miss Prouse," she said. "I am." "Is the wagon nearby?" He said yes and led her to it, and they drove 6 miles out of town in near silence, which was not unfriendly silence so much as the silence of 2 people who have used up their words on letters and do not yet know how to use them in person. She looked at the house. She looked at the lean-to. She looked at the well which Tobias had not mentioned required a kick. She said, "Your letter said 4 rooms. He said the lean-to is functional space. She said, "Functional space is not the same as a room." He said, "No, it is not." There was a pause. She said, "Show me the well." He demonstrated the pump and the kick. She watched him. She tried it herself. The water came. She said, "All right." That was all she said. And something in Tobias Greer, some tight thing in his chest that had been tight for a long time, loosened just slightly, because he had expected argument and what he got was a woman who looked at the thing that was wrong and asked how it worked. The first week was not easy. This is not the same as saying it was bad. Easy and good are not the same thing, and people confuse them more often than they should. Nettie could cook. This was not in question. She had been cooking for her father for 11 years, and before that she had learned from her mother, and her mother had been a practical woman who taught practical things. The biscuits were good. The salt pork was competent. The coffee was strong but not cruel. Tobias ate everything without comment, which was his version of enthusiasm, and Nettie correctly identified it as such. What was hard was everything else. Tobias Greer was a man of established habits, and his habits had been established in solitude, and had therefore never been required to account for anyone else. He woke at 4:30. He did not speak until he had been awake for an hour. He took his coffee standing at the kitchen window looking out at the dark. He kept his tools in a specific order and put them back in that order regardless of what task he had just completed. He had opinions about where things were stored. He had never told anyone these opinions because there had been no one to tell. And so they had simply solidified inside him into something resembling law. Nettie had her own organization. Within 4 days there had been 2 quiet arguments about where the flower lived, and 1 loud argument about whether the hammer belonged on the left side of the workbench or the right. Tobias won the hammer argument because it was his workbench. Nettie won the flower argument because her reasoning was better, and Tobias, whatever his faults, was a man who recognized better reasoning when it was explained to him at sufficient length. What Tobias did not understand yet, what he had not begun to think about, was why Nettie Prouse had left Indiana. He knew the surface of it. Father dead, house sold, circumstances reduced. He understood those words. He did not understand what it felt like to be 34 years old in a town where everyone had known you since you were 9, and had already decided who you were. To be the daughter of a man who had opinions the town didn't always share, and to carry that in the way you walked into the post office. To have spent 11 years being capable and quiet and good, and to have it mean nothing beyond the walls of a house that was no longer yours. Nettie Prouse had not come to Wyoming because she was looking for adventure or love or reinvention. She had come because in Indiana she was already finished, and she was 34 years old and she was not finished. She had expected, based on the letter, a capable man with a working operation and enough stability that she could build something on top of it. She had not expected warmth particularly. She had not expected conversation. She had expected competence and the space to be competent alongside it. What she got was 11 head of cattle, a 4th room that was a corn shed, a well that needed to be kicked, and a man who hadn't spoken a complete sentence before 6 in the morning in what appeared to be years. She did not cry. She had not cried since her father's funeral, and she had promised herself then that she was done doing things she could not afford to do. Instead, she walked out the back of the house after supper and stood looking at the mountains. Wyoming had mountains that Indiana did not have, and Nettie looked at them for a long time in the last of the light, and then went back inside and went to sleep and woke up in the morning and decided to learn the cattle. She asked Tobias to teach her. He had not expected this. He had expected a woman who cooked and kept the house and left the cattle to him. That was the arrangement he had imagined. It was not an unreasonable imagination. It was how things were generally divided. Nettie stood at the corral fence on a Wednesday morning with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and said, "I need to know what I'm looking at. If one of them is sick, I want to know it before you do." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I don't like not knowing things that are happening in front of me." This was, Tobias reflected, the most sensible thing anyone had said on his property in several years. He opened the gate. Over the following 2 months, Nettie Prouse learned cattle the way she had learned everything in her life. By refusing to stop until she understood it. She learned to read the way an animal stood. She learned the difference between a cow that was off her feed because the weather had turned, and a cow that was off her feed because something was wrong inside. She learned how to move through the herd without scattering it, how to check hooves, how to read the condition of the winter grass, and what it meant for how much hay they would need to get through to April. She learned the names of the Eckhart brothers. This took longer than expected because the Eckhart brothers were difficult to tell apart and had the conversational range of fence posts, but by October she knew that the older one, Duff, was actually decent if you asked him a direct question, and that the younger one, Remy, would do anything if you called it a competition. Tobias watched all of this happen. He was not a man given to narrating his own reactions. He noticed things and put them away and did not necessarily examine them until they became unavoidable. What he noticed was that his operation, his 11 head, kick the well, lean to 4th room operation, ran differently with Nettie in it. Not easier particularly, just differently. Like a machine that had been missing a component, and had been limping along without it, and did not know, until the component was installed, exactly how much it had been compensating. He noticed that she worked harder than he had expected, and asked more questions than he had been prepared for, and never asked the same question twice. He noticed that she wrote letters. Every Thursday evening she sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and paper and wrote, and he did not ask to whom. But the envelopes went out on Friday, and sometimes envelopes came back, and she read them in the morning before he was up, and by the time he came in from the early check she had folded them away, and was starting breakfast. He noticed that she kept a book in her apron pocket. A small one, worn at the corners. He could not read the title from across the room and he did not ask about it. One evening in late October after supper, Nettie was at the table writing her Thursday letter. Tobias was mending harness by the stove. The lamp made the room smaller and warmer than it was. Outside, the first real cold of the season was pushing under the door. She finished her letter. She folded it. She looked at the book she had set on the corner of the table and then she looked at him. She said, "Do you read?" He said, "When there's reason to." She said, "What do you consider a reason?" He thought about it. He said, "Instructions, prices, letters." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Have you ever read something just because someone read it to you?" He said he had not. She opened the book. It was Thoreau. Walden. She read him the first 2 pages. Not performing, not teaching, just reading. In the plain voice she used for everything. The same voice she used to describe a sick cow or a storm coming over the range. The words came out in that voice and they sounded different than they would have, grounded in something real. Like she was reporting on something she had personally verified. Tobias sat with his hands still in the harness and listened. He did not say anything when she finished. She did not ask him if he liked it. She put the book down and went to bed. The next evening, after supper, she read him 2 more pages. This became the arrangement, not a stated arrangement, not a negotiation, simply a thing that happened in the evenings, the way things that become habits happen. Once, then again, then it is simply what is done. By November, Tobias was waiting for her to open the book. He would not have admitted this. He would not have known how to admit it. But he sat down after supper with his mending or his accounts and he waited. And when she read, he listened with the kind of attention he gave to weather. Not as a performance of attention, but because the information mattered. What Thoreau said about the economy of a life. About the weight of things you chose to carry versus the weight of things that had accumulated without your choosing. Hit Tobias Greer somewhere he had not known was available to be hit. He had lived alone for years and believed himself to be a simple man with simple needs. The book was suggesting that simplicity was not the absence of thought but the product of it. That you had to think very hard and very honestly to figure out what was actually necessary. He was still thinking about this in December when he fixed the 4th room. He did not tell her he was going to do it. He spent 2 weekends in November cutting boards and 1 weekend in early December fitting them, and when it was done it was a real room with a real wall and a window he'd salvaged from a busted frame at the Eckhart brothers' place. He put in a shelf along one wall. It was not a beautiful shelf. The joints were visible and one end was slightly lower than the other. It held weight, which was the thing it needed to do. He said when she came to see it, "The window doesn't seal perfectly, I'll fix that in spring." She stood in the middle of the room for a moment. She said, "You built a shelf," he said, "you have books." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the window and the imperfect seal. She said, "I have 4 books," he said, "you write letters, people might send more." She stood there a moment longer. Then she turned back to the shelf and ran her hand along it, the low end, the visible joints. She said, "It's good work," he said, "it's adequate." She wrote to her sister in Indiana and asked her to send the books their mother had left behind, the ones that hadn't been sold with the house. She had not asked for them before because she had not been sure there was anywhere to put them. 8 books arrived in January. She shelved them. She continued to read to Tobias in the evenings. He continued to listen with the attention he gave to weather. He read 2 of them himself, on nights when she was up late writing and he had finished his accounts. He started with the Thoreau because it was familiar. He ended with a collection of essays by a woman whose name he did not recognize, who wrote about the geography of Kansas, in a way that made him think about the geography of Wyoming differently, about what it meant to know a place so well you had opinions about its specific light. He thought about what kind of light Wyoming had. He thought about it for several days. He mentioned it once, at breakfast, and did not mean to mention it, but it came out. He said, "There's a quality to the light here in January that I don't know the word for." Nettie looked at him. She said, "What does it look like?" He described it. He described it badly and then better, and then he stopped because he had run out of words, and she said, "Blue, but not cold blue. Blue like something that isn't sorry for being blue." He looked at her. She shrugged. She said, "I've been looking at it too. The thing that became love, that crossed from arrangement to something neither of them had planned for and neither of them had a word for yet, happened in the last week of January, and it involved the well. January 24th. Temperature at dawn, 34 below. Not the record in Wyoming, not by a margin anyone wanted to discuss. Cold enough that the handle on the pump had seized overnight and the iron had contracted, and the mechanism that required the kick to function had become in the night something more complex. Tobias had gone out at first light. He had been out for 40 minutes trying to free the pump before Nettie came to the barn door, not the well, the barn, where he had retreated for the tool he needed, and said, "Tell me what you need." He said he needed the long-handled iron bar from the far side of the workbench, and she was gone and back in 2 minutes flat with the right tool and no wasted time, which was so specifically what was needed that he didn't even remark on it. They worked the well together for an hour in 34 below. He worked the mechanism. She held the torch, a simple kerosene lamp in a glass box he'd built for exactly this situation. Though this was the first time the situation had been quite this extreme, and she held it where he needed it, adjusted without being asked, moved the light when he moved, stayed with it when her hands started to go. He noticed her hands going. He finished the well before he said anything. The water came. He capped it and turned and took her hands in both of his, and breathed on them, long and slow, standing in the yard in 34 below with the lamp between them and the Wyoming morning coming up blue over the Laramie range. She said, her voice even, her hands beginning to come back, Your letter said a working operation, he said. Your letter said practical background and sound constitution, she said. You got a practical background, he said. You got a working operation, it works. Today is evidence. She almost smiled, almost. In Nettie Prouse's vocabulary, almost smiling was a significant event. She said, we are both being somewhat generous with working. He said, I thought so when I wrote it. She said, I thought so when I wrote mine. They stood there a moment longer. The blue light came up. His hands were still around hers. Neither of them moved. She said, quietly, I would not have written it differently. He said, after a pause that was the longest pause I have ever read as a person trying to pay attention to such things. Neither would I. They stood in the cold yard with 2 honest admissions and a repaired well in the particular blue light of Wyoming in January coming over the mountains, and what they had was not at all what either of them had sent for. It was better. They both knew it in that moment and neither of them said so. Because some things are said best by the staying. Tobias Greer and Nettie Prouse were married in March 1888. By the preacher who came through Laramie on the first Saturday of the month. Nettie wore a dress she had brought from Indiana, the good one she'd been uncertain about bringing, and she was glad she'd brought it. Tobias wore the pressed shirt. The Eckhart brothers attended, which surprised everyone including the Eckhart brothers. Over the next 25 years they expanded the operation from 11 head to over 200. They added a real barn, a root cellar, and eventually a second story to the house, which Tobias built with better joinery than the shelf but still insisted on calling adequate. The shelf remained in the 4th room, which became a proper room, and then a study, and then the room where Nettie read in the evenings and Tobias came to sit when his accounts were done and the light was good. The bookshelf grew. More books arrived from Indiana, then from a bookseller in Cheyenne that Nettie had found correspondence with. By 1900 there were 63 books, shelved by subject, with a second shelf below the first that Tobias built in 1895, and that was by general agreement better than the first. Nettie wrote to anyone who would write back. She kept correspondence with her sister in Indiana, with a woman in Colorado she had never met but whose letters were excellent, and eventually with the bookseller, who turned out to have opinions about the Kansas essays that were worth arguing about. Tobias read. This was not something he had expected to become a fact about himself. By 1900 he had read 31 of the 63 books. He had opinions about 7 of them, which he expressed at breakfast over the course of years, in the same voice he used to discuss cattle prices and weather. Nettie listened to all of it with the same attention she had given the cattle, steady, specific, and occasionally willing to disagree. He told Duff Eckhart, once in the spring of 1903, standing at the fence line between their properties, I hired a wife and got a foreman and a library and someone who reads out loud in the evening. He paused. Best arrangement I ever entered into. Duff Eckhart, who was not a man of many words, said, the reading out loud, does that help? Tobias thought about it. He said yes. Duff said, and that was the end of that conversation, which was about as much as either of them had to spare. Nettie Prouse Greer died in 1921 at the age of 67. The books stayed on the shelves. Tobias read them again slowly over the next 4 years. He died in 1925. He was 79. His last winter, he had someone read to him in the evenings because his eyes were going. And the person who read to him was his daughter-in-law, who had never read Thoreau before, and who stopped at the same passage that had stopped Tobias the first time. She came expecting practical circumstances and room to be capable. He came expecting someone to hold down the other end of the work. Neither of them had ordered what they got. The particular blue light of January, the evenings, with the book, the well repaired in 34 below. And the standing in the cold yard with 2 honest people telling the truth for the first time. They were both wrong about what they needed, the thing they built instead. Out of a kicked well and a crooked shelf, and Thoreau read aloud in a lamplit kitchen while the wind came off the Laramie Range, lasted longer than either of them expected anything to last. I find myself thinking about that. About what we order and what we get, and how sometimes the distance between them is the whole story. So tell me, who do you think arrived with the bigger lie? And would you have rewritten your letter if you were them? Leave it in the comments. I want to know what you think.